Imagine a world where the sun never truly rises. Not because of nature, but because the sky itself has been choked by the soot of a million shells. You are standing in a ditch, 2 meters deep, filled with knee-high mud that smells of sulfur, rotting wood, and something far worse that you choose not to name. This is the Western Front, 1917. To your left, a boy no older than 18 is shivering, his eyes fixed on the gray line of the horizon. To your right, the constant, rhythmic thud of distant artillery, the drum fire, reminds you that the earth itself is being pulverized. Between you and your enemy lies a scar on the face of the planet called No Man's Land, a tangled web of rusted barbed wire and cratered mud where time doesn't exist, only the wait. The wait for the whistle, the wait for the gas, the wait for the end of the world. Today, we go beyond the cinema screens of Sam Mendes or the desaturated frames of Netflix. We dive into the grit, the rust, and the absolute industrial madness of the Great War. This is not just history. This is the reality of the men who stood in the mud and changed the course of human destiny forever. Before 1914, war was a matter of movement. Galloping horses, bright uniforms, and the clash of sabers. But the Industrial Revolution changed the rules of death. By the time the German Schlieffenplan stalled at the Marne, the generals realized that the machine gun had turned the open field into a slaughterhouse. To survive the reign of Lead, men began to dig. What started as temporary foxholes evolved into a continental labyrinth of trenches stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. Over 700 kilometers of sophisticated, subterranean cities designed for one purpose: static attrition. The trench was not just a hole. It was a machine. You had the fire trench at the very front, where soldiers stood on firing steps, peering through periscopes. Behind it, the support trench housed the reinforcements and secondary defense lines. Further back, the reserve trench held the supplies and tired souls waiting for their next rotation, connecting them all like veins in a bleeding arm where the communication trenches. Everything was reinforced with timber, sandbags, and the omnipresent barbed wire, a 19th century farming invention that became the most effective killer of the 20th century battlefield. If you tried to cross it, you were caught like a fly in a spider's web, waiting for the Maxim guns to finish the job. This was the stalemate. The Great War had become a factory of souls, where thousands of men were traded for just a few meters of mud. Living in the trench was a war against biology. The mud wasn't just dirt and water, it was a toxic soup. Because the drainage systems were often non-existent, soldiers stood in water for days or even weeks. This led to the dreaded trench foot, a fungal infection so severe that flesh would literally rot and peel off the bone. Amputation was the only cure for thousands. Then came the rats. Millions of them, fed on the abundance of human remains. These corpse rats grew to the size of small cats. They would crawl over sleeping men, steal food from their pockets, and become a constant, scratching reminder of the fate that awaited everyone. And the lice. Every soldier was chatty, the slang for being infested with lice that lived in the seams of their uniforms. They caused the trench fever, leaving men shivering with high temperatures and unbearable body aches. But even in the mouth of hell, the human spirit refused to be completely extinguished. On Christmas Eve, 1914, something miraculous happened along the British and German lines. It began with a few carols drifting across the frozen mud of No Man's Land.
Stille Nacht mit Silent Night.
Slowly, tentatively, men who had spent months trying to kill each other climbed out of their trenches without their rifles. They met in the center, shook hands, swapped cigarettes, and shared photographs of their families. For a few brief hours, the industrial machinery of death ground to a halt. There are even accounts of spontaneous football matches being played on the very ground that would later be soaked in blood. It was a haunting reminder that the soldiers on both sides had more in common with each other than with the generals who commanded them from miles away. The Christmas truce would never be repeated on such a scale again, as the high command on both sides grew terrified that their killing machines were becoming human again. But for that one night, the trench was not a grave, but a sanctuary of shared humanity. On April 22nd, 1915, near Ypres, a strange greenish-yellow cloud began to drift toward the French lines. The soldiers thought it was a smokescreen for an attack. They were wrong. It was chlorine gas. As the gas hit the lungs, it reacted with water to create hydrochloric acid. Men began to drown on dry land, their lungs burning from the inside out. The panic was absolute. The introduction of chemical warfare removed the last shred of chivalry from the war. It became a contest of masks, the terrifying, bug-eyed canvas hoods that turned every man into a faceless monster. While the land was locked in a stalemate, the oceans became a new frontier of terror. Germany unleashed the U-boat, the undersea boat. These silent predators of the deep stalked the Atlantic, sinking millions of tons of supplies destined for the Allies. The war was no longer confined to the trenches of France. It was a global strangulation. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, which killed over 1,000 civilians, including Americans, began to shift the global consciousness. It proved that in an industrialized war, there were no innocents. The ocean had become a vast, cold cemetery where the only rule was unrestricted submarine warfare. This escalation would eventually draw the United States into the conflict, tipping the scales of history and ensuring that the Great War truly deserved its name as a world-shaping catastrophe. But the stalemate on land still needed a physical solution. From the factories of Britain came Little Willie, the prototype of the tank. In September 1916, at the Somme, these iron beasts crawled over the trenches, crushing barbed wire and ignoring machine gun fire. For the first time, the parity of the trench was broken. The age of industrialized, armored warfare had arrived. The tank was the physical manifestation of the war's end, a reminder that eventually, steel would conquer the soil. The Great War was a furnace of innovation born from necessity. Many objects we use today were forged in the desperation of the trenches. Before 1914, men used pocket watches. But in the chaos of no man's land, fumbling for a watch could mean death. Officers began soldering lugs onto watches and strapping them to their wrists, the birth of the modern wristwatch. Then there was the medical revolution. Because of the millions of wounded, doctors had to find ways to store and transport blood. The war perfected the use of sodium citrate to prevent clotting, leading to the first blood banks. Even the sanitary pad began as a surgical bandage made of cellulose, an ultra-absorbent material designed for battlefield wounds. Even our clothing changed. The trench coat was originally a specialized garment by Burberry designed specifically for officers standing in the wet trench. From the tea bag to the zipper, the world we inhabit today is built on the technological leftovers of a generation that was being destroyed by those very same industrial advancements. The physical wounds of the Great War were visible, but the mental scars were often far deeper and more permanent. When the survivors returned home, they brought with them a condition the world was not yet prepared to understand: shell shock. Men who had stood firm under fire now flinched at the sound of a closing door. They suffered from night terrors, uncontrollable shaking, and a profound sense of alienation from the civilian world that had remained safe while they were in the mud. The lost generation wasn't just a literary term, it was a clinical reality. Society often met these broken men with a mixture of pity and suspicion. In an era where manliness was defined by stoicism, the inability to forget the horror of the trench was often viewed as a character flaw. Yet, these veterans paved the way for modern psychiatry and the eventual understanding of PTSD. Their silence was not a lack of courage, but a testament to the fact that some experiences are so traumatic that language itself fails to capture them. As the years passed, the scale of the loss became overwhelming. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had no known graves. Their bodies had been vaporized by shells or swallowed by the mud of no man's land. To give the families a place to mourn, nations began to select a single, unidentified body to represent all the fallen. In November 1920, the unknown warrior was buried in Westminster Abbey. This body, chosen at random from the battlefields of France, was brought back with the highest military honors. He could have been a coal miner from Wales, a clerk from London, or a farmer from the countryside. He was everyone's son, everyone's brother, and everyone's father. This act of symbolic burial transformed collective grief into a national identity. The tomb became a place where the absolute silence of the dead met the eternal memory of the living. It reminds us that while history books record the names of kings and generals, the true burden of war was carried by the anonymous millions whose only memorial is the freedom we often take for granted. When the guns finally fell silent on November 11, 1918, the world was unrecognizable, for empires had collapsed. 10 million soldiers were dead. An entire generation of young men had been erased from the map of Europe. The trenches were eventually filled in, but the scars remain. Even today, in parts of France and Belgium, there are zone rouges, red zones, where the soil is so saturated with unexploded shells and arsenic from gas that humans are forbidden to live there. The war literally changed the chemistry of the earth. We look back at 1917, or All Quiet on the Western Front, and we admire the cinematography. But let us never forget the smell of the sulfur. Let us never forget the weight of the mud. The Great War was supposed to be the war to end all wars. It failed. But it gave us a warning that still echoes through history. When we choose industrial destruction over human empathy, the trench is the only place left for us to stand. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into history. This is Kebut Film, from screen to reality. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world.
Also. And we had much kicking.